First came a knock on the door. Rabbi Charlie let the man who had knocked into his synagogue, Congregation Beth Israel, in the suburbs of Fort Worth, Texas. The man was cold, so Rabbi Charlie made him a cup of hot tea. The Saturday morning Shabbat service had started. Rabbi Charlie stood on the bima, the raised platform at the front of a synagogue. He began a prayer facing away from the congregation so he could face Jerusalem. Then he heard a click, which he thought sounded like a gun. When he turned around, he didn't see anything unusual in the congregation. He finished the prayer, and then during the silent prayer that followed, he went to talk to the man who had been drinking the tea. He wanted the man to know that he was welcome to stay for the service or to leave if he had just come in to get tea. Rabbi Charlie didn't want him to feel awkward about leaving if that's what he wanted to do. While he was talking to him, the man pulled out a gun. Rabbi Charlie and the 3 people who had attended the service that day in person were then held hostage for 11 hours. They were ultimately able to escape out a door when Rabbi Charlie threw a chair at the man. The man holding them hostage was then killed by the SWAT team that entered the building. As you might imagine, Rabbi Charlie has been giving interviews to various newscasters since the event happened. Mary Louise Kelly from NPR interviewed him and asked him this question: "Will you offer hot tea to a stranger again?" Here is Rabbi Charlie's response. "This was one individual. I have led thousands and thousands of services at the congregation over my 15+ years with the community. This was the first time we had something along those lines. So when someone comes to the door, yes, I'm going to do the same kind of visual scan that I did. And I'm going to assume that even if they do not look like the stereotypical person who's going to come into a Jewish synagogue, I want them there. Whether there's somebody who's Jewish, who's coming in from another community or from our community, or whether they're not Jewish, and maybe they're exploring Judaism for the first time, or they just want to see what a Jewish service is all about because they're curious, and they're asking, am I going to belong? And I want them to know that they are going to belong. Hospitality means the world. Hospitality means the world. That was this rabbi's response to a traumatic event that happened because he opened the door and welcomed the stranger in. This is the kind of wild kindness that makes fierce love real in our world. This is what we are talking about today. This is the kind of love that will heal the world, and that's why we are exploring what fierce love is during this season of Epiphany. As I thought about wild kindness in preparation for this sermon, I thought about my earliest experiences of it, and I thought about what I taught my kids about it. One of my earliest memories of wild kindness was when I had just turned 9 years old. I was about to enter the 4th grade, and my family had moved to Central California to a 5-acre farm. On the same day we moved into our new ranch house, I decided to ride bareback on the enormous quarter horse that our parents bought and was waiting for us in the field. A neighbor girl wanted a ride, and I put her on behind me. And then my older sister decided to feed the horses at just that moment. And the quarter horse, who by then we had named Chris, took off, and we both went flying through the air. And I ended up in the hospital with a broken leg, a broken arm, a concussion, and some other bumps and bruises. I had to stay overnight in the hospital for observation. By 7 p.m., my family had all gone home, and I was alone at the hospital in a town we had just moved to that day, and I was terrified. My roommate was a 16-year-old who had broken her jaw and who had had her jaw wired shut and who moaned nonstop because she couldn't talk. The nurse who was on duty was young, and she knew how scared I was. As often as she could, she would come into my room and try to reassure me that there was nothing to be afraid of and I would be okay. But her wild kindness came when her shift ended at 11 p.m. I had been too afraid to go to sleep because hospitals are so creepy at night. When her shift ended, her boyfriend came to pick her up, and she brought him into my room and introduced him to me, and then she told me that they were both going to stay with me until I fell asleep. She took my hand and sat next to my bed, and eventually I did fall asleep. Almost 50 years later, I still remember this act of wild kindness. And I think about how it has influenced some of my decisions to stay longer with someone in the hospital than I might normally stay, especially if they are afraid. That's how wild kindness works, and that's how people are changed. When I was a young parent many moons ago, I was supposed to teach my kids about stranger danger. Teaching kids about stranger danger meant telling them not to trust anyone they didn't already know. It meant telling them not to talk to strangers. It meant telling them that grown-ups who were strangers could hurt them, so it was important for them to only trust the people they knew. At the same time, though, I was also supposed to teach them how to be polite, how to speak when spoken to, how to show respect to adults, and how to be kind to everyone. Clearly, there were some cross purposes there. Add to it the fact that my kids are what is known in the church world as double PKs, or PKs squared, meaning pastors' kids. And the cross purposes grew exponentially. Every single Sunday at church, there were strangers who were talking to them. Fairly early on, they questioned the rules around stranger danger. Why did we make them talk to some people and then lead them by the hands away from other people? If I saw a man by himself hanging out at the playground or at the park where we went to play, I would tell them to stay away from him and to stick close to me. Or if someone came to the door of our house who we didn't know, I would tell them not to answer the door. At the same time, we would take them along for what in those days we called service projects. And if we were building houses or feeding people who were hungry, we expected them to talk to the people even though they didn't know them. We were trying to instill a sense of compassion, kindness, generosity, and hospitality. And for a young kid, it was very confusing anytime a stranger was involved. I wonder how many of us still feel confused about stranger danger. How do we balance hospitality and our call to welcome the stranger with our fear and our knowledge of stranger danger? As soon as I heard the interviews with Rabbi Charlie and listened to his response about how he would definitely open the door again, I realized that he is someone who lives by a love ethic, which we talked about a few weeks ago. Love is his deeply held value, and love is made real with welcome and hospitality. When he said that hospitality means the world, he is referring to a very ancient faith tradition that says hospitality is how we make God manifest in the world. Hospitality is how we become God enfleshed in the world. We become God with skin on. Love is hospitality, and hospitality is love in action. Will Rabbi Charlie feel some fear every time he opens the door now? Undoubtedly. Fear is part of what keeps us alive. But fear is also the very thing that can keep us from living. At some point, as parents, we realize that we cannot immobilize our kids with fear. We have to give them the confidence to face their fear and push on anyway. And that means, as parents, we have to deal with our own fear. If you look at what is called these days a helicopter parent, a parent that continuously hovers, that parent has deep, deep fear that is being projected onto that kid. Whether or not you are a parent, each of us has to get in touch with and manage our own fear, or we project that everywhere we go. Fear is perhaps one of the biggest barriers to wild kindness. Some of us have extra bedrooms in our houses or condos or apartments. When we know someone needs a place to sleep, why don't we take them home with us? Fear. What if they rob us? What if they harm us? What if they bring bugs into our home? What if they won't leave? What if they show up every day and knock incessantly? What if they disrupt our lives? What if they steal our identities? And the list goes on and on. I have asked myself more times than I can count why I don't take people home when it's so cold outside. If every person who had an extra bedroom in the city of Chicago were willing to let someone stay with them during the winter months, we might not see anyone sleeping outside. Fear is one of the reasons we don't do that. Another reason we don't do that, though, is that we've been taught not to. In our culture, and especially in white culture, family and home are private. The way capitalism works is to make us believe that we have worked so hard for what we have, and so it's ours and ours alone. If someone else doesn't have enough, that's their problem, and they didn't work hard enough. Fortunately, with widespread information and with truth-telling by Black people and so many others who have finally been able to be the authors of their own histories, we now know that the narrative about hard work and private wealth is a narrative spun by white people who would not have their wealth if it had not been for the hard work through enslavement of Black people, and if it hadn't been through the stolen land and extermination of indigenous people, and if it hadn't been for the wars against Mexico and the stolen lands in the West. But even with a proliferation of truth and the real histories, so many of us continue to believe that our home is private and our wealth is private and our job is to protect them both at all costs. And it seems like that is the thinking that also poisons churches. During the pandemic, churches closed their doors and locked them. There were foundations and city entities looking for buildings that could house some of those experiencing homelessness when shelters were required to cut their populations in half in order to do social distancing. I heard from a foundation that most of the churches and faith communities they approached asking for use of the building said no. Their buildings were closed to everyone. The same foundation has been trying to save some of the shelters that are in danger of being closed for good because the churches they are located in are being sold. What they have found, much to their dismay, is that churches would rather sell to a developer and get top dollar than to sell for less money to a foundation committed to retaining the shelters. That is the real life impact of the narrative that our job is to protect our wealth at all costs, even when the entire reason a church exists is to show the rule-breaking kindness and fierce love that Jesus lived. In her book on fierce love, the Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis talks about the story of the Good Samaritan and tells her own story of a white Canadian woman who was her Good Samaritan when she and her then husband were in a bad car accident in Canada. The white woman did not know Jackie, but when Jackie was crying in the hospital and overwhelmed and unable to stay overnight there with her then husband, the woman went over to Jackie and offered to get her some food, take her home, let her spend the night, and then take her the next morning to the rental car place. Jackie describes how she could not believe this total stranger, a white Canadian woman, would offer this to her, a black woman from the United States. Jackie admits that she was too afraid to go to this woman's house and spend the night. She is a black woman being invited to a white woman's house, and she says, I felt real fear about that. And so instead, the woman offers to pay for a hotel room for her, and on the way, they picked up food. She dropped her off and then came back the next morning and picked her up and took her to the rental car place. The story of the Good Samaritan that Ben read this morning is a story of rule-breaking, wild kindness. And it's also a story of crossing borders and breaking boundaries. It's the story of crossing the borders of religion and culture and race and age and societal expectations. And the woman who reached out to Jackie in Canada crossed every border and boundary to be sure that Jackie, a complete stranger, was safe and cared for. When the lawyer asked Jesus, "Who are the neighbors we are supposed to love?" Jesus responded with this story about what love looks like, what the wild kindness looks like that makes love real. We have some work to do to examine ourselves and figure out why it is that we don't cross the street to help the wounded sometimes. Why is it that we don't bring the cold strangers inside, even if just into our church? Why is it that when we see someone hungry, we don't share a meal? Who are the strangers we are afraid of? And how can we be neighbors? I know that we are living through incredibly difficult times right now. Prudence would have us hunker down and conserve all that we have. Jesus would have us love extravagantly and give it all away. Rabbi Charlie would remind us that hospitality is at the heart of why we exist as a church and even as people. We all have fear, even if our fear might be different one to another. How will we acknowledge our fear, have faith in the God who calls us, and open the door to strangers and make some tea? Amen.